Welcome all. If you're just now joining us, if you haven't had a chance yet, please find the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you already have questions, drop them in now. We will do our best to answer in real time with email follow-up if necessary. We'll be getting started in less than a minute. Welcome to the community.
Yes, but my
Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to Pacific Environment's webinar, Biofuels in Shipping, Guardrails for Climate Integrity and Equity. My name is Davina. I'm the Climate Policy Director for Pacific Environment, an NGO based in the United States with consultative status at the IMO, at the International Maritime Organization, where we advocate for zero emission solutions in the maritime sector. Pacific Environment's mission is straightforward yet ambitious. Accelerate the transition to zero emission shipping, tackle climate change, and build healthier ecosystems for the well-being of people and our planet. Today's conversation is about one of the many critical questions on the table at the IMO. Next slide. Can biofuels serve as a credible transitional compliance bridge for maritime decarbonization without undermining climate integrity, land use, or equity? Or do current frameworks risk enabling paper decarbonization that shifts emissions and impacts elsewhere? The IMO is shaping its fuel lifecycle analysis framework right now. The decisions made in this window will determine how fuels are evaluated, influence global fuel markets, land use dynamics, and the pace of the transition to zero-emission shipping. In the words of Dr. Robert D. Bullard, environmental justice is not a luxury, it's a necessity, and it must be included in this framework. We're here to bring grounded perspectives and concrete proposals to the decisions that need to be made. With us to make that happen, next slide, are four outstanding voices joining us. Gonca Seber from International Council on Clean Transportation. Her research focuses on life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuels and techno-economic assessment of biofuel production pathways. She'll review where IMO discussions on biofuels stand and expand on the indirect market effects that current certification frameworks are not capturing. Colin Murphy from University of California at Davis Institute of Transportation Studies, where he's also the co-director of the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Initiative and director of the Biofuel Land Use Change Program. Colin will share specific actionable policy guardrails to prevent paper decarbonization based on the latest Gazamp analysis. María Jisset Calvo Saad from the Colombian Ministry brings a perspective most ILUC discussions are missing: what it looks like from a country that is actively producing biofuel feedstocks and managing land use pressures in real time. And last but not least, Jamie Yates, Pacific Environment's Climate and Renewable Energy Manager. She will set the stage by providing context and highlighting why this conversation matters now before moderating a discussion with all three speakers. Here's how today will run: 3 presentations of 10 to 15 minutes each, followed by a moderated discussion and then audience Q&A. You don't need to wait until the end to answer your questions. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat, and type them in as they come to mind. We'll gather them for the discussion. Today's session is being recorded. The slides and the recording will be shared with all registrants after the session. And with that, let's get started. Next slide, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Jamie Yates.
Thanks so much, Davina. I'm just going to really quickly situate us within this webinar before we get to the main part of the show, which is hearing from our experts. But as this is a webinar around biofuels and ILUC and the LCA framework within the IMO, or the International Maritime Organization, I just wanted to quickly situate us in where we are in this conversation that's been happening and will continue to happen over the next few months. So the IMO has adopted its 2024 LCA framework back at MEPC, the Marine Environmental Protection Committee meeting during the 81st session. And that sets the initial framework of how sustainable marine fuels will be evaluated against a set of sustainability criteria. One of those criteria is land use change, and specifically direct land use change as well as indirect land use change. And we're going to hear a bit more in terms of those definitions and how to differ between them from Gonca and our other experts. But we have the 2024 LCA framework as the first step, but it also left a number of aspects and how those are evaluated to be determined in future meetings and sessions. And one of those is ILUC, as that conversation has continued amongst the group of experts that is the GAZAMP LCA working group that Davina mentioned. And so they have produced 2 reports since then, and there will be a third coming, I believe, later this year as well, where they further discuss how ILUC can be evaluated and how the IMO might operationalize its evaluation and determination of ILUC within a fuels LCA certification. And so within that, the questions are, is it evaluated on a quantitative scale or a qualitative aspect? And they've initially determined it to be a qualitative risk-tiered approach with high risk, medium risk, and low risks set across projects as well as fuels. And that question is a bigger one that Gonca and our other experts will also touch on more. But how do you evaluate biofuels across an entire feedstock, across pathways, coming from various regions for this global framework that will affect so many fuels and pathways? So next slide, please. And then lastly, just to also situate this, as Davina mentioned, this is an initial conversation. There's a wide range of perspectives and viewpoints on this, and we wanted to bring together many different viewpoints as well as potentially continue this conversation in the future with other voices brought in from around the world to share how it's evaluated, how it's operationalized, what the priority aspects are, and what should really be focused on during these conversations that are happening. And so within that, Pacific's environment position on biofuels is that within this North Star of our work towards a rapid transition to zero emission shipping, that interim measures of which biofuels can play a limited transitional role within need to be credible and bounded and not delay or displace truly zero emission, scalable, sustainable fuels. And so within that, we need to determine how to reduce any unintended consequences to land, food systems, and frontline communities within that. So within that position and hearing from other perspectives, I'm now going to pass it very briefly back to Davina, and we're going to get started hearing from our experts now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for that important context setting. As Gonca gets ready with her slides, I want folks to know that prior to joining ICCT, Gonca worked in the areas of environmental economics research group at Hasselt University in Belgium and in the Laboratory for Aviation and the Environment at MIT. She conducted LCA for sustainable aviation fuels and contributed to the development of fuel pathways for a carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. Gonca holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And Gonca, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Davina, and hi everyone. I'll just share my slides. Hope you can, oops, sorry. we can see them. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Gonca Seber. I'm a researcher at the ICCT, and we are a nonprofit organization, and our aim is to reduce emissions from transport. So today I will share a little bit about the climate risks of biofuels and within the shipping context. I'll first start by sharing a little bit about the biofuels used in transport today. As you can see from the map here that I put for like as an example for renewable diesel capacity, there are already a lot of renewable diesel producing facilities around the world. Some of them are operational. There are also a lot of them that are planned. But then the main biofuels used in transport today are bioethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel. So while ethanol is mostly produced from sugars and starch-based feedstocks like sugarcane or corn, biodiesel and renewable diesel uses vegetable oils or waste fats, oils and greases. So today the share of biofuels used in shipping is very small, below 1%. But because biofuels can provide emission savings, they could be used as drop-in fuels for shipping, and they could help comply with the emission reduction trajectories that are set for shipping. And so it's very likely that the IMO policies could increase the demand for biofuels, and particularly for food and feed-based biofuels. And I'll explain next how this is possible. So IMO policies right now, they are fuel neutral. And so because decreasing the emissions is the main goal here, doing it so in the cheapest way possible would appeal to the fleet owners. So any fuel would comply as long as they provide the emission savings that are necessary. And within the biofuels, food and feed-based biofuels are commercially available today, and they are relatively cheaper when compared with the other, advanced fuels. So for example, the plot here compares the cost of greenhouse gas reduction for various biofuels that we looked at the ICCT. So this is, in other words, dollar cost per ton of CO2 emissions reduced. And you can see here that renewable diesel from vegetable oils, used cooking oil, or biodiesel, these could help comply with, how it is written currently with the tier 2 base trajectory, because they are below that, and the cost of using them as in a blend is below that. And of course, depending on the LCA methodology and the price for the fuels, these results can change. But currently, like how we assumed, the used cooking oil based biofuel is the cheapest option among the ones that we looked at. And so next, we developed a cost optimization model where we assumed blending with biofuels and keeping the emissions below the tier 2 trajectory. So in order to avoid the high penalties. And then our approach prioritizes, since we saw that used cooking oil is the cheapest biofuel, our approach prioritizes using that up to its supply limits, and then continue using vegetable biofuels for blending. And then we didn't constrain vegetable oil by its supply. And we found that under this scenario, under our assumptions, the vegetable oil demand could increase by more than 3 times if by 2035, under all these conditions, and if even all the biofuels from vegetable oils is used towards shipping, that won't be enough, or that will only be enough until the 2030s. So it's definitely not a sustainable solution. And another way is to think about this, that having such an excessive increase in vegetable oil demand could have other consequences, such as food price increases or vegetable oil price increases, and it can also cause deforestation. So when we look at the vegetable oil use for biofuels, we see an increasing trend following the biofuels policies of the 2000s. And according to Food and Agriculture Organization, around 40% of this increase for vegetable oils is from biofuels production between 2000 and 2022. And so the biofuels policies could also affect the price of these feedstocks. And there's considerable evidence that historical biofuel demand trends have led to price increases and contributed to commodity value spikes. And if we consider, like thinking about the example that I just give, like if the amount of vegetable oil demand, if the vegetable oil demand increases by 3.5%, half times, sorry, that could increase the vegetable oil prices by 3 times. Of course, depending on the market conditions and supply responses. But so the policymakers in the EU, being aware of these issues, limited the contribution of food and feed biofuels to renewable energy targets. And for example, they capped it for road transport and excluded them from aviation and maritime. And giving a more concrete example, a recent study found causal relationship between biofuels demand and increase in vegetable oil prices and deforestation using an econometric approach, making use of supply and demand relationships and real-world data and high-resolution satellite data. And according to this study, the global biomass-based diesel expansion between 2002 and 2018 raised palm oil prices by approximately 21%. Above the business as usual levels. And also to note that these major vegetable oils are found to be highly substitutable. So as a result, policies that boost demand for one of these could affect the other vegetable oils price markets. And the study also finds this price increase drove the conversion of 1.7 million hectares of forest to palm conversion in Indonesia and Malaysia. So the major concern with some of these vegetable oils are, for example, with palm and soy, is peatland drainage and deforestation respectively. So that's known to cause the land use change, which will bring us to our next topic. So land use change emissions are the most important factor, influencing the emissions or the carbon intensity from this feed-based biofuels. And there are two types, or there are two ways that they can contribute. One is the direct land use change, and the other one is the indirect land use change. Direct land use change, DLUC, is the expansion of cropland in response to biofuel demand. So land with high carbon stocks is converted to cropland to grow feedstocks for biofuels. For example, in this example here, we consider, you can see that forest is converted to produce biofuels. So as a result, the carbon stored in the land is released, increasing the carbon intensity of the fuel or the greenhouse gas emissions. And direct land use change emissions are physically measurable, and you can look at the carbon stock changes of the land. And these are also localized to the project site, so they can be attributed to a specific project and could be avoided by sustainability criteria, which prevents feedstock growth on high carbon stock land. Indirect land use change, on the other hand, happens when land currently used as cropland, for example, for producing food, is used for biofuel production. So it's displacing that. So then this demand for food does not simply go away, right? And it needs to be supplied somehow. So elsewhere, for example, new cropland would be formed that might cause deforestation. So this global market-mediated pressure on land is called basically the ILUC. And unfortunately, it can't be measured physically because it's not directly related to the project site. So one thing that you do in one country can cause indirect land use change in another. So basically, you cannot, say that I take the best measures and so ILUC doesn't happen in my project. It's not really just, bound to that. And then economic equilibrium models are used to calculate or estimate ILUC, and Colin, I'm sure, will talk about those in more detail, or could talk to them in more detail. And then these models include a certain degree of uncertainty because there are multiple assumptions and variables. But however, ILUC emissions are real, they're higher than zero, and they warrant consideration in biofuels policies. And so I think it's important to say IMO is not the first policy venue to struggle with this question of how to tackle, how to respond to ILUC, and could learn from, other policies. So when we look at the, other fuels policies that, looked at ILUC or to try to mitigate ILUC, there are two main themes, we can say. So one is the ILUC quantification, so providing emission factors, and the other one is phasing out, limiting, capping, or exclusion of the food and feed, or like, let's say, high risk feedstocks. So, and like I said, there is uncertainty in these numbers, but for example, how International Civil Aviation Organization is doing it, multiple models might be used to, to decrease this uncertainty. So that's one way to do it. If it's going to be a qualitative, like the IMO is now or currently decided on that, the EU's Renewable Energy Directive phases out high ILUC risk feedstocks, such as palm right now, or they can limit food feed biofuels, and Fuel EU, Maritime, and Refuel EU that are specific to maritime and aviation sectors are now excluding these high risk feedstocks. And then currently at the IMO, there are some considerations. Yes, high ILUC risk projects that are defined by those displacing food and feed crops, so the definition of ILUC, and then a significant expansion into land with high carbon stock. And then low ILUC risk projects are defined by those that supply additional feedstocks, but only additional use should be considered as low ILUC. So these will not disrupt the existing land uses, basically not causing ILUC. And then the GSAMP group also recommended that there be a third group, which is medium risk. But in our view, defining high ILUC risk feedstocks is the first step towards managing ILUC. So basically, I will finish with so. Like I said, considerations on high ILUC risk feedstocks should be a priority, which I think the GSAMP group is now trying to start with the project-based ILUC, which may not help mitigate ILUC. And so to avoid, these effects that I talk about on food prices, detrimental for deforestation, the IMO could consider capping or excluding the high feedstocks at the global level, because ILUC is a global phenomenon, or promote the use of advanced biofuels, such as those from agricultural waste, residues, municipal solid waste, or e-fuels, maybe in the long run. And if food and feed-based biofuels are not excluded, safeguards has to be in place, basically, to prevent or at least mitigate ILUC. And capping or excluding, or even determining high ILUC risk feedstocks, that could be done using quantitative metrics, like using emission factors that are already calculated elsewhere, or basically, if taking a qualitative approach, looking into expansion into high carbon stockland, for example, these are some of the things that could be done. So with that, I'll stop here. And yeah, give it back to Jamie, I guess.
Thank you, Gonca. An excellent review of how ILUC operates and the IMO and other bodies, how they're evaluating it currently. And we'll now hear more from Colin on his research and group's modeling into ILUC. So over to you,
All right.
Colin.
Thank you, Davina. Are we
Almost there.
there? We go. All right. Slides good?
Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here talking about this. I'm Colin Murphy, obviously, from UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are the largest sustainable transportation-focused university research group in the US, possibly the world. We have centers that cover everything from EVs to land use and planning and transit. We have a particular connection to low-carbon fuel policy because our founding director, Dan Sperling, co-created the low-carbon fuel standard that's used in California, several other states, British Columbia, also Canada and Brazil. I think it's a fantastic model for a life cycle-based fuel policy. Would love to talk about how it could be applied in the marine context. We spend a lot of time researching that with the states that have adopted them early. But this talk is a little more high level on sort of the background and the context of fuel policy with all the other changes that are going on in transportation globally. So I just want to thank all my colleagues for their help. Everything I present is a result of work that we did collaboratively. So in the marine space, we know there's going to be a very long-term need for drop-in alternative fuels, and even though global shipping, accounts for only a couple percent of greenhouse gas emissions, it is a couple percent that we know there are technological solutions for, and we can't afford to sort of leave anything on the table. Right now, this fleet is fueled primarily by marine bunker fuels. Oh, I noticed that graph is not displaying correctly. That's a bummer. Okay, the graph was supposed to show that the average age of most ocean-going vessels in the global fleet is well over 20 years, and so that means the vehicles that burn these fuels have an exceptionally long lifespan. The transition to lower emission powertrains is going to be slow. That's where liquid fuels are really required, and I will make sure to get that corrected in the version that we circulate out afterward. There are a number of alternatives that have been proposed in the marine space. Right now, like I said, everything is using primarily marine bunker oil of some kind. There's various names for that. It's sort of a residual of petroleum processing. And one of the important things to remember is that marine bunker oil is not only a fuel for ships, but it's also a waste disposal mechanism for petroleum refineries. A lot of the heavy metals, the sulfur, and other sort of unwanted elements of crude oil end up in bunker fuels and are disposed by burning them and sort of scattering them over the ocean. There are obviously environmental consequences of this, but there's also economic consequences. It means that if this route is unavailable for refineries and they start having to directly remove these metals and sulfur, it impacts the economics elsewhere in the petroleum supply chain. It also makes it very difficult for alternative fuels to compete on an economic basis with marine bunker oil, given that the bunker oil is serving a dual role. There are a number of alternatives. This is certainly not an exhaustive list here. Things like renewable diesel or biodiesel on the renewable diesel side. Or biodiesel, you're primarily using waste oils, and Gonca discussed the challenges there and also the constraints upon supply, especially the supply of things like used cooking oil, which would be a really preferable fuel for low greenhouse gas emissions. There are opportunities to co-process, lower carbon or biological components in conventional petroleum refining. This is where you sort of drop a few percent of perhaps a vegetable oil or used oil or a biocrude into an existing refinery. This doesn't, this only has the potential to displace a few percent of the produced fuel, but a few percent on the scale of global maritime consumption can lead to meaningful reductions. Ammonia has been a fuel of interest in the marine sector. The challenge there is it is a tremendously toxic and corrosive chemical, and the sort of safety risks entailed with fuel leaks or the rupture of a major fuel tank are pretty significant. So I think there's some challenges there to overcome. Methanol or biomethane are other options. They've been, we've seen pilot projects for these. They can be made from a variety of feedstocks. At present, right now, we have a lot of LNG being shipped as a commodity and also used as a marine fuel. There are opportunities to make methane from renewable sources, either through anaerobic digestion or potentially like gasification. All these come with their own things. And over the long run, we have e-fuels, and I'll talk a bit about those in a few slides. Generally speaking, if you have a waste-based fuel, and this is, truly a waste, you can get some pretty deep greenhouse gas reductions, easily over 50%, 75%, perhaps even a little more of that, but it is difficult to define what is actually a waste. And many of the things that are currently defined as wastes under existing regulatory programs actually have some sort of use. And so you have to consider the impacts of the loss of that use. For purpose-grown crops, we see these entering the on-road transportation space, vegetable oil, renewable diesel or biodiesel, and ethanol. The greenhouse gas impacts are pretty uncertain, largely because of uncertainty around indirect land use change. At their best, they might be able to get you to 50% lower greenhouse gases, but I think that requires a especially optimistic a combination of conditions and ILUC assessments. There's also a lot of risk that many of these purpose-grown crops are actually higher greenhouse gas over their full life cycle than the petroleum that they mean to displace. We have very cellulosics seen that biofuels can be done badly, and it's important that we avoid anything that's going to bring these sort of higher carbon biofuels in there. Cellulosics have a lot of potential to get, sort of in the middle of that range, maybe 40 to 70% greenhouse gas reduction, but the technology is still struggling to scale in the commercial space. One of the things that we know about the fuel space is that the marine sector is going to need liquid fuels for the future, but they're not going to be the only sector that has this constraint. Aviation is going to depend upon liquid fuels for the foreseeable future. Some parts of the long distance trucking sector might. That is still kind of to be determined. There's a few other sort of niche cases in the transportation portfolio, and you have to go and consider the demands from all of these sectors that are going to be dependent upon liquid fuels in sort of as a whole. So the graph here is from International Transport Forum analysis. This is kind of fuel demand and potential supply in 2050. This includes a lot of fairly optimistic assumptions about deployment of electric vehicles in the sectors that can take them, improvements in yield and conversion efficiency and vehicle efficiency across all sectors. And what you see is in this 2050 scenario, with a lot of changes already baked into the analysis, the demand from the hard to abate sectors, these sort of purple and green sectors, total global biofuel production at its most optimistic estimate can't really supply all the demand just from these sectors alone. And so this really, I think clearly shows that biofuels are at most going to be a piece of the portfolio. How big of a piece remains to be determined, but they cannot do it alone, and something additional is going to be needed. The challenge, obviously in the near term, is these things are more expensive than the petroleum fuels they're trying to displace, and we know that they can be done wrong and be done in very unsustainable ways if the policies are not carefully designed, as well as the production systems that create them. So the big problem with biofuels, and Gonca alluded to this, or not alluded, actually directly discussed this in her talk, is indirect land use change. And so, as Jisset said with the figure she showed, indirect land use change occurs when global demand for agricultural commodities causes the expansion of land. And the challenge, like you said, is this land may occur in a place completely unrelated and unconnected to the fuel production system that's actually causing this increase in demand. Like she said, you cannot measure this directly. You could give me all the technology they have in Star Trek, and I could not build you an ILUC sensor, because while we can measure land conversion, the important thing for ILUC is knowing the causality, why that land converted. And the challenge is to assess this, you have to do it through modeling. These models are highly uncertain. So a few years ago, the EPA did an assessment around their RFS set rule, where they looked at all the models that sort of could make a credible claim to be able to assess indirect land use change effects in the US. So this is a table from that report. It's talking about soybean oil biodiesel. Soybean oil is a commodity that the US grows a lot of. We're very familiar with. Biodiesel is a fuel that has been on the market for many years. So this is not sort of really advanced novel technology. And when you look at the estimates of land use change impact, the high end is about 30 times greater than the low end. So at the low end, at those sort of 10 kilogram per million BTU estimates, those are, if that is the actual ILUC impact of a soybean biodiesel, then that ends up being a fuel that could get you 40 or 50% greenhouse gas reductions compared to petroleum. At the high end, at that 295, that's a fuel that is 3 times more carbon intensive than petroleum, and that makes this a very difficult place for regulators to operate, because you have this really high uncertainty. At present, there are no models of ILUC that really have a strong claim to be good enough for regulatory use. Every model that's in the space today has at least sort of one major omission or blind spot that means that the uncertainties here. Beyond that, all of these models require analytical assumptions just in order to make the model complete and functional. And many of these assumptions do not have a single objectively right or wrong way to be established. There are kind of many valid ways, and that means that even if we have a lot of research and development go into the modeling, there is always going to be uncertainty around estimates of ILUC from any given ILUC model. Now, a lot of regulatory programs and stakeholders are hoping that we can use sort of sustainability certification as a protection against ILUC. And certainly sustainability certification is a good thing. It is part of the best practices in the biofuel space and should be there. But kind of project level sustainability certification isn't really going to work. And the reason why is, if you think about where the sort of global vegetable oil sector was prior to biofuels, you have both sort of what we call good or higher ILUC oils and lower ILUC oils in the mix that were consumed for things going into, kind of when calling oleochemical industries, also I think the food industry sort of qualifies in this category. So it's making things like vegetable oil for human consumption or animal feed or cosmetics and consumer products. When you have biofuels start to enter the market as they did in the mid to late 2000s and really sort of took off over the last 10 years. You have a new demand, and given that a lot of these biofuel industries are seeking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, many of them have adopted preferences for lower ILUC and lower greenhouse gas oils in general. So you see the supply, because they want to make fuels that actually achieve the greenhouse gas reduction goal. So you see the supply shift where the biofuel sector starts claiming a lot of the lower ILUC oils. And we've absolutely seen this in the sector so far, where most of things like the UCO, the used cooking oil, and the tallow, things are wastes and have a lower greenhouse gas footprint, are predominantly going into biofuels right now. But what happens now is, sort of as Gonca showed in her figure, that now the other industries, the ones who are making all the other products and that largely operate in an unregulated space, they have to increase their consumption to to stay in business, and they then increase the consumption of the higher ILUC oils. And so a project level sustainability certification looks at the supply chain for one single product, whereas the harm might come in the supply chain for a different product, but that harm occurred because the biofuel emerged in the market and claimed the feedstock that had previously been going to one of these other uses. So project level sustainability certification cannot by itself be an answer to biofuel, to ILUC risk, and sort of global models are needed. You can use global models to inform the development of things like a risk categorization based approach, but you can't get out of the fact that you're going to need that modeling in order to define what fuels are in what risk categories, and these things are going to change over time, and so they have to be very, very complete, very updated on a regular basis. So if we think about how to deal with ILUC risk, given where we are now, where we don't really have good enough models, here's how I think about it. And I actually have a YouTube video online where I spend sort of 45 minutes getting into the details. So if this is a topic you're interested in, please feel free to go watch it. There's a link here as well as on the last page. And when we circulate this, the links will be live. So if you think about having a policy that's going to provide some level of support for biofuels, right? It's going to provide a little support for biofuels, or a lot more or less. Now, ideally, we would be able to analytically determine what the optimal amount of support is to sort of maximize benefits and minimize costs, both economic and environmental. But because we don't have the models that are capable of doing that right now, you kind of have to throw out that hope and start thinking about, how do these policies work, and how do the risks propagate through them? So if you think about how ILUC integrates into fuel policies, if your fuel policy, sort of gives more support for fuels that provide more greenhouse gas benefit, as it should, as things like the low carbon fuel standard and most of the European policies do. If you assess ILUC as being larger or more impactful, your policy is probably going to give less support for those kinds of fuels, and vice versa. If you assess ILUC at the low end, then it's probably going to give more support. So if we know that we don't have the ability to precisely find what the right answer is, if we know we're going to be wrong, the question is it better to be wrong on the high side or the low side of this spectrum? And I think we want to think about the risks involved there. And so if you think about the risks of over-consuming biofuels, if you sort of underestimate the ILUC impact and your policy gives biofuels more incentive than they should have, then there are certainly risks there. When you think about the way that carbon cycles in natural landscapes and is affected by conversion to agriculture, you see that carbon tends to accumulate very slowly but is lost quickly. And so this ends up being sort of an irreversible process on the 3 to 4 decade time scale that we have to really make a big impact on climate change. You have things like biodiversity and species loss, and those all sometimes cannot be recovered, at least not in the time scales that matter to humans. And then you have the problem of, if you adopt a policy and it turns out to be harmful, and then you have to sort of walk it back or cancel it, there are stranded asset risks. There are risks that you may have caused some sort of policy lock-in onto kind of a path dependency, or that you just might delegitimize the value of policy signals to leverage the kinds of investment we're going to need. Now, on the other side, if you overestimate ILUC and you lead yourself to underconsume biofuels, there are risks here as well. And I don't want to downplay it. This is not sort of an easy slam dunk decision. There are risks on both sides. And the main risk is you lose the opportunity to decarbonize. If you are overestimating the impact of biofuels, then you're using less of them and more emissions are occurring because you have foregone this tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You also sort of lose the technological development opportunities and the economic growth. So there are risks on both sides. I think when you really sort of think them through and try to weigh them together, the risks are asymmetric, and the risk of overconsuming biofuels is significantly worse. The impacts are worse and more likely. I think this argues for a somewhat conservative or kind of risk-averse approach on biofuels. I wanted to say a couple quick words about e-fuels. I know there are a lot of sectors that are interested in e-fuels as a long-term solution. This is where you use electricity to disassociate carbon dioxide, either captured from an industrial source or captured straight out of the atmosphere. You split that into carbon monoxide, you get hydrogen from hydrolysis and combine them together into a hydrocarbon. And so this at least can tell a coherent story about how it could produce a lot of fuels at a very low carbon intensity, but there are some challenges here. And so this graph looks at e-fuel production in the on-road sector. I couldn't find an equivalent for marine fuels, but I think the numbers are certainly in the ballpark and they tell the story. And the problem is that the e-fuel production process right now is very inefficient, that about half the energy that you put into the process is lost as either waste heat or byproducts that have very little value. Now, we know that this can improve through sort of research and development and improve technology, and that needs to happen. We need to deploy some commercial scale facilities for that improvement to occur. But beyond that, even with that improvement, it's never going to be perfectly efficient. And so you have to think about where the electricity is coming from. And given that most power grids around the globe still depend on fossil fuels for a large fraction of their supply, there's a chance if you put big demand from e-fuel production onto the grids, you're just going to extend the life of fossil fuel power plants, and that undoes a lot of the desired greenhouse gas benefit for that. So I think we have to sort of work on deploying some pilot projects, let the technology mature, and use that time to keep decarbonizing electricity supply, so that in the future you will have both a technology and a renewable energy resource capable of producing the volumes that are required. But in the near term, there is a risk that sort of premature large-scale deployment of e-fuels could have some unwanted greenhouse gas consequences. So to sum it all up, this is a big complex space. Obviously, it's difficult to get everything into a single brief presentation. We know that alternative fuels are going to be necessary, but it's not just going to be the marine sector that needs it. Aviation and a few others are going to as well. And you have to consider the demands from all of these sectors together to understand how much resource can and should go to any one category. Most of the biofuels that are on the market today, most of the options, have at best a kind of moderate incremental greenhouse gas benefit, and at worst can be worse than the petroleum. And so understanding the differences there are very important. Even the best kind of crop-based fuels that we see today, they're likely to be bridge fuels. They're going to reduce emissions slightly, but it is a very long bridge. It's going to be a long time before a fuel that is 20% cleaner than petroleum becomes a problem that has to be sort of driven out of the fuel supply. So there is a role for bridge fuels, given the long-term transition that we're looking at. We haven't really decided, we being the marine sector and the research community as well as regulators, on what particular molecule is going to be supplying the marine sector. There's some questions about whether it's better to adopt multiple different molecules and let regions kind of specialize in one or another, or try to consolidate down to a single highly interoperable fuel. That is an interesting question, needs some more research to determine. I think the main thing that is needed right now are large-scale demonstration projects for things like e-fuels, cellulosics, to figure out which of these technologies have the capacity to get where we need to be over the long term. So happy to take questions, happy to circulate these slides, and please feel free to reach out. Last thing I would say is we are hosting an indirect land use change conference at the end of May. Anybody who's interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me. If you haven't already received an invite because you're on one of our lists already, I'm happy to send one to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colin. Those are exactly the kinds of specific, actionable guardrails this conversation needs, please take a look at the Q&A. Maybe there are some answers you would like to give Colin. Some have already been placed in the Q&A box. And now we turn to the perspective that's often missing from these discussions. Most ILUC frameworks are built on models. We've heard some of them. What we're about to hear is what it looks like from a country that's managing these pressures in real time. What we're about to hear is María Jisset Calvo Saad. She joins us from Colombia Ministry. Colombia is one of Latin America's significant biofuel producers, and Colombia's experience with land governance, degraded lands, and the equity dimension of biofuel expansion is exactly what any durable IMO framework needs to take seriously. María, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Please share my presentation, Davina.
Sí, ya se ve, pero ya se
Oh,
ve.
okay, thank you. Good morning. My name is María Calvo. I work on the Ministry of Mines and Energy, where I lead to the teams developing biofuel strategy and alternative fuels of the decarbonization of transporting. Next, please. Today, I will share the ministry perspective on how to achieve the responsibility development of biofuels and the decarbonization of the maritime sector. Today, the global discussion of biofuel in maritime transporting is a critical point. On one hand, there is an urgent need to reduce emission in the short term, but on the other hand, a fundamental question arises. Are we achieving real emission reduction or simply seeing impacts to the land use, ecosystem, and food system? From Colombia perspective, this is not theoretical debate and is unreal, negotiate and the intersectoral produce land management and public policy. Next, please. So Colombia, Colin, one of the lead biofuel producers in Latin America. In recent years, biodiesel production reached around 14,000 barrels per day. Bioethanol produce has reached 396 million liters per year. These biofuels are blended to leave around 10% in liquid fuels, contributing to the emission reduction in the transporting sector. And the sea time, this system coexists with a strong fossil fuels base. Colombia has retains capacity exceeding 450,000 barrels percent, where diesel is a key fuel for freight and maritime activities. However, what is a critical the Colombian case is the land dimension. Colombia has around 40 million hectares dedicated to agro activities. Of these, nearly 34 million hectares and use the for livestock of under station and low production systems. The size time is estimated that between 15 and 15 million hectares degrade or not using. This highlights and key structural issues. There is a significant room to increase in producing real to land use with expanded to deforesting. Is this fundamental shape how ILUC builds in other contexts? Next, please. Okay, police to the unrest Biofuels and ILUC for the Ministry of Mines and Energy, together with the other authorities, Colombia has built a strong biofuel policy. In this base, not only on the energy transition, but also on land use, environmental protection, and rural development. It is guided by three key principles. One, environmental integrity. Biofuels in Colombia must show real and measured emission reduction. We use life cycles analyze aligned with the international methods to look beyond use combustion. We also have fuel quality standards to ensure before safety and environmental complaints. And we are not working to include wording sustainable criteria, shoots and indirect impacts lead illutes. The second part, land governance and regulation frameworks. In Colombia, biofuel are not only an energy issue, but also lot and environmental issues. No, others policies land the ethanol and biodiesel. This land critical and blend programs, curling around 10%, depends on the regions. In Colombia, this is supported by land and use planning, environmental controls, and deforesting monitoring system. All the health insured biofuel does not expand in scientific ecosystem. Together, this instrument aimed to ensure that biofuel feedstock production does not expanding in the high carbon stock areas are a strategic ecosystem. And the third, sustainable in Colombia, working to the have traceability and certification for biomass. This includes tracking feedstock origins, aligned with international standards, and preventing fraud in the supply chain. This is key as global demand for low carbon fuels grows. However, we reorganization sharing ILUC cannot be managed with global models alone. In Colombia, I depend on land use, governments, and local economy and condition. And so C is not only modern issue, but a long management illusion. That is with Colombia integrating biofuels into broader land, environmental, and rules development policies. This help ensure real decarbonization with negative impacts on land use. Next, please. Thank you. One of the most important elements in Colombia ILUC profiles is an evaluation of the great land with an estimate it fits the 20 million hectares in the condition we are really the opportunity to spend biofuel feedstock production without leaving deforesting, why not displacing for the production, why not increasing pressure of carbon-rich ecosystem. This is particularities relevant with compared to global ILUC models, with often assumed expansion occurs of the span of foresting. In Colombia, span can extend course in land use optimization and recovery. But it is recurrent store governments, incentivities, and monitoring systems. We know this is risk of allied remains. With Colombian biofuels, are not only on climate mitigation tools, they are all on drive of rural development, jobs created, production inclusion, and economic stability and in agricultural regions. For example, sector has palm oil and sugar cane support thousands of rural youths and regional economics. This is introduction and quality dimension that is the often of the fuel captured in the ILUC models. I think Colombian do not treat biofuel as an installation energy pollution, but as part of the territory system. Harsh regulation frameworks start early, but I am constant evaluating to incorporate others process with decarbonization sector and use land favors. ILUC cannot be solved only with the better models. I require better land governance. Please, next. Okay. In the maritime sector, biofuel briquet shellings, there is a competition for food stock, supply limits, reasonable countries, and tracing issues. More demand for shipping call us put pressure on land. This is a very relating of Colombia. We are a maritime country with coastal on both ocean and strong portal system. Port like Cartagena, Buenaventura, and Santa Marta are key for trade. So the maritime sector is critical for our economy. This meets full transporting effects, not only emission, but also energy demand, infrastructure, supply chains, and land use. This is context. Colombia is part of the Green Budget 25 through the MAR. This help as volume policies improve institutes and other fuels. It's all position Colombia is an active player in the marine energy transition. In Colombia, biofuel use governance and manage strong frameworks. Key actors including Ministry of Minas and Energy, Ministry of Agro, Ministerios of Environmental and Sustainable Development, and General Maritime Direction, DIMAR, and additional Colombian maritime governments is supported by a growing port and supply system where authorities should, as DIMAR, play a key role in ensuring safe, efficient, and sustainable maritime operation. The DIMAR Colombia is part of Green Budget 2015 and technical cooperation initiative led by the International Maritime Organization. This initiative support countries in reducing greenhouse gas emission from shipping through capacity building, police developments, and the identification of the sustainable fuel pathways. And for Colombia, it's particularity related in scale its marine activities or the role of bounds and logistic hub and potential supply along carbon fuels. This is reflects Colombia activity alignments with global maritime decarbonization and will ensure that national policies remain grounded in territorial, environmental, and economy realities. Next, please. Excuse me. Sir. Okay. For to conclude, biofuel can play a role as traditional solution in the maritime sector, deliver real emission reduction, avoid shifting impacts to land of the food system, and contribute to the supply and the sustainable development. In this context, initiatives with green budget 2050 show that mission is really underway. The chain node is ensure that international friends, because only under those conditions will be biofuel be a really solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. The real world grounding is exactly what makes this conversation different. And unlike purely model approaches, your experience highlights how national policies, land governance, and the use of degraded lands can really influence whether biofuel expansion leads to deforestation or sustainable outcomes. It also introduces a critical equity dimension. Biofuels are tied to economic development, rural livelihoods, and national sovereignty. So challenging one-size-fits-all ILUC assumptions that may not reflect local realities. And so we're very thankful to hear that perspective. I think the intel strengthens the credibility and durability of any ILUC framework. So we've had 3 speakers who've given us regulatory science, producing country reality, and the state of play at the IMO. And now Jamie will bring them into genuine conversation with each other. A quick reminder, please keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. We're collecting them throughout the session. And I'm now going to hand it over to Jamie Yates, who will moderate this discussion. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Davina. And I'm going to ask our panelists to come video on and be spotlighted as well for this part of the discussion. I'm going to start off with, I think, the question that is sort of the most to the point of this webinar and this discussion, in terms of the IMO, of which our speakers have a variety of experience with and knowledge. I'm curious if there is 1 or 2 things that you see as being needed to be prioritized within any LCA framework, but specifically one for the global shipping industry, in order to prevent biofuels from, sort of shifting emissions around instead of delivering true decarbonization. So I'm going to maybe focus first on Gonca and Colin, and then go to Maria afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, I can start. I think the most important thing is, like, besides what we already talked, not to repeat myself, that to avoid business as usual practices be certified as low indirect land use change. So if what is being done, for example, I can just continue with Maria's example, for example, degraded lands. Yes, that might work, but all we need to do is, like, look, what's the business as usual case? If the degraded lands were, I mean, first, the definition of degraded lands, for example, is it a robust definition? And then, is it additional to what would have been occurred in that land without intervention by biofuels policies? So if biofuels policies does not exist, if nothing is going to happen on that land, and then you all of a sudden come and have this biofuels policy, and then that pushes a biofuels production in that land, then that's additional, just to give an idea of how it sounds like. So I think that's important in general. And then I talked about the high ILUC risk feedstocks, and we can come back to the degraded lands later on, but not to extend. I think the defining and identifying high ILUC risk feedstocks is very important, because, as Colin said, like, once these things happen, these policies come alive, and it's really hard to go back. Some people talked, like, in another workshop that I attended, like, we will need ILUC after 10 years, like that was like an idea, and it should happen now, and it should happen with the strictest criteria. 10 years later, or even 1 or 2 years later, might be too late, because once these things start, once the commodity markets are affected, ILUC will have an effect, and it might have this effect might be deforestation, which will be very, hard to turn back. So I think with that, I'll stop here. Like one of the important things I said, like high ILUC risk feedstocks should be determined, and that's the most important thing. And then business as usual practices, should not be certified as low ILUC. So these are the two main points.
Yeah, totally agree with all that. I think, in addition, you need to create a framework that updates the assessments regularly. And there's always going to be some tension between updating your assessments enough to keep them, very accurate and reflective of current practices, but also keep enough policy stability that somebody who needs to make the investment of the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars it takes to build a large scale low carbon fuel production facility, they know they can get policy support for the 10 or 20 years they're going to need in order to recoup that investment. But one of the common questions in life cycle analysis and in other things is, how does what's happening compare to what otherwise would have happened, right? What is the normal practice? Normal practices evolve. And if you lock something into policy, then you might be comparing, your practice 20 years from now against a practice that is just patently outdated and no longer a realistic thing. The other thing I would say is you have to consider, a lot of these indirect effects in sort of academia, we call it consequential life cycle analysis, where you look to say it's not just the things that are directly connected to the biofuel production system that matter. It is things that might be connected via markets, like indirect land use change, or changes in electricity. If you demand a lot of electricity, that can have big impacts on the grid. And you have to understand that. Where even if a alternative fuel producer commits to using renewable electricity, if they go and consume a lot of the available renewable electricity on the grid, a fossil fuel power plant might need to stay online longer in order to keep everybody else on the grid still supplied. So those things have to be taken into account, which makes it a very complex analytical space. So you need to make a big investment in the assessment framework, and building the models and keeping them updated, and sort of the human capital as well to understand these systems and help inform policy.
Okay, I think police can generate statistics that change land use, but more that simple change is a goal to be more efficient. And it is used in creating more sustainable systems. Is strolling about change land use, they make more sustainable and also more productive and sustainable for sectors. It's all.
All. In terms of thinking about these regions outside of just a single country, how should the indirect land use change and these more global market mediated risks to these carbon rich lands, so separate from improving degraded lands or what might be classified as degraded lands, but these more consequential indirect connections between different markets across the world and across outside of one country be included in LCA guidelines that might shift deforestation pressure rather than reducing it. I know that we've talked a bit about this already, but if there is any specific, outside of feedstock pathways to touch on.
So my colleagues and I at Davis, we recently launched a major kind of multi-year research effort to look at ILUC and try to advance the space forward. And it is a big complex challenge. We're not going to be bored anytime soon. I think one of the things that we have to be aware of is this is such a complex analytical space. It is going to take time. And I think a lot of the processes for addressing ILUC over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, it has been a regulator is developing a policy, needs an answer, and they need it in 6 months to a year. And people have to sort of go to the tools that are already out there, as imperfect as they are. And has led to a lot of discussions that I think start at the outcome and work backwards, right? Different advocacy groups come in with the model they like that gives them the outcome they want. And the argument has been, my model is better than your model, and not how do we improve the models and how do we improve the tools and come up with better frameworks. And I wish we'd started this 5 or 10 years ago, so we had answers today when a lot of the policies are being developed, but unfortunately we didn't. I think we have to sort of work through that process, but it's not just an analytical process. Like I mentioned in when I was speaking, there are certainly things we can do to narrow those error bars on ILUC estimates through improved data, improved modeling techniques, improved analytics, but some parts of the uncertainty are because of the assumptions that go into it. And we need to go and have conversations among policymakers and researchers to decide what are the sets of assumptions that should be kind of common to all these, and let us evaluate these on a more apples to apples basis, right? All those assumptions, they start reflecting values. What do you prioritize? What do you value? And how do you want these systems to function? And that's something where science isn't going to have the only answer. That needs kind of input from stakeholders across the spectrum to understand what values should be reflected in the assumptions that we build into these systems. So to some extent, it's a process of conversation and negotiation and alignment as much as it is a process of analysis and improving our scientific understanding.
Thanks, Colin. I'm actually going to, I think, jump in and just build on that answer and question, and maybe ask Maria how Colombia is thinking and using models as well as governance, and that aspect that Colin just mentioned of moving just beyond analysis and research in conversation with policymakers and those in governance.
Hi, good morning. This is Jose Manzano. I will assist Maria Jisset Calvo with the response to your question, because she is still trying to perfect their English skills. So excuse me if I take this chance to help her in this time. María, nos están preguntando desde el punto de vista de la política pública en Colombia y lo que ha mencionado Colin relacionado como con la toma de datos, con los análisis, digamos, en general, para, pues sí, para efectivamente la estructuración de políticas y métodos y demás, cómo se está trabajando, qué tan importantes son los datos y cómo se está trabajando en Colombia en esa parte.
Listo, entonces, muchas gracias, José. Pues simplemente digamos que los datos son los que nos permiten tomar decisiones técnicas que se aterrizan dentro de la política pública, ¿no?
Well, Maria
Digamos,
is toca que me des ahí un espacio. Maria is telling me that currently in Colombia we are trying and focusing our efforts in increasing the data suppliers and the data knowledge that we have for the definition of the public policy and the different linkage between the different government entities in order to provide a successful scenario for the development of this ULCS. Dime,
yes.
continúa.
Entonces, digamos, todos esos datos a la final son la base para construir la política pública. Sin los datos realmente no se pueden tomar decisiones, digamos, técnicas que nos permitan, pues, conocer el real aprovechamiento de cada uno digamos, de los suelos, de las tierras que nosotros tenemos y sobre todo, pues, la eficiencia que pueden tener, ya sea para producir combustibles, producir alimentos o, digamos, manejar un sistema silvopastoril, que es lo que da mayor eficiencia y sostenibilidad actualmente al uso de la tierra.
We're still trying to collect as much data as is possible in the different uses of the land available in Colombia in order to define the different projects and strategies for obviously sustainable projects and strategies for the development of the industry and the different products that you can conceal on all the supply chain, on all the supply producing chain of the industry.
Yeah. No more.
I don't know, Jamie, if you need any clarification, because I couldn't catch the complete question. I just catch a couple of phrases. So if you need any more information or support, I will be more than happy to help you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much for assisting with translation. One quick follow-up question is if there is consideration for international effects in Colombia's policies and how that is incorporated.
Ok, María nos pregunta Jamie que si dentro de todas las consideraciones que se están haciendo, se están tomando en cuenta los factores internacionales para la toma de decisiones, o sea, digamos como en general lo que aborda la política y lo que aborda las
Listo.
decisiones.
Listo, sí, digamos que cuando nosotros creamos la política pública, es decir, toda la regulación referente pues al trabajo de biocombustibles, siempre tomamos estándares internacionales porque a la final parte importante es, es poder generar una comercialización, ¿no? De estos mismos productos. Entonces, los estándares internacionales nos permiten tanto tener un producto apto a nivel nacional como pues a nivel internacional. Entonces, la mayoría no decir todos, están establecidos teniendo en cuenta los estándares de regulación internacional, también aterrizado pues a la realidad de, digamos, de materias primas y del tipo de suelos que tenemos en Colombia.
Okay, Maria, gracias. So Maria is telling me that obviously it is a key factor to establish different policies and projects, obviously taking account and providing the different international standards. There is no sense on developing this kind of projects only to attend the national like demand or the national intentions of the different like different niches, business niches. This is definitely an interest for Colombia to develop these industries, accomplishing the different technical and international standards. Otherwise, we won't be able to produce a product that is easy to sell in the international markets, or is not even is not possible to allocate the funds and the final investment decisions of the international stakeholders to develop these kind of projects in Colombia.
You so much. I'm gonna quickly just see if Colin and Gonca have any questions or response to that. And I think we're then reaching the point where we want to turn to audience questions. So I'll pause here and
I don't think I have much to add beyond what I said in my talk, which is you have to consider this at a global level. You have to consider this in context with the other sectors and uses that are going to demand this. I suspect that in many cases, planning for long-term fuel needs and decarbonization has occurred at a sectoral level. And what you often see is if you take sort of the plans of each sector and stack them all together, they kind of combined overdraw on the potential biomass resource or the potential renewable energy resource that might be available, because they sort of probably assume they have better access or more preferential access to this than they want. So you have to really think about this at a global level. And given the degree to which both agricultural products and energy products are traded globally and move around the world very easily, all these analyses have to have a global element at some point in order to really understand the full effects.
I
Sí,
can.
María.
Sorry.
Sorry, Gonca, I will take the word to give the message to María. So, María, lo que nos dice Colin básicamente es que sí, definitivamente es necesario hacer el análisis a nivel global, tomar en cuenta los factores internacionales, de alguna manera hacer la suma de la demanda, que teniendo tú toda la demanda general, también puedes empezar a definir el nivel, digamos, de biomasa que tú tienes que conseguir o que tienes que reunir y cuáles son los mejores, digamos, canales de acceso para acceder a esa demanda. Porque al final del día, si tú tienes toda la suma de la demanda, pero también tienes completamente definido y mapeado la oferta que tienes para cubrir esa demanda, pues te permitirá efectivamente entrar con mucha más fuerza en el mercado internacional, no solo en agricultura, sino en general en otros subproductos asociados a la energía y asociados a la lista. So, thank you. Gonca, you go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to, just one more comment, because we talk about how it's hard and uncertain with these ILUC models. But since IMO is more like, going through the qualitative route at least that's the intention right now, if nothing changes. And I just want to point out that, for example, giving example from the EU's Renewable Energy Directive, they don't do ILUC modeling to estimate the emission factors, but they still use quantitative criteria, for example, expansion onto high carbon stock land. and that's still scientific and that can still provide, an identification for these, ILUC risks and all that. If people are really, in the end, if in the IMO, then the consensus is that we are not doing emission factors. That's like another way to do it, to identify and sort of cap or exclude if it's going to be done for the high ILUC risk feedstocks, just as a second alternative to ILUC modeling.
Y lo que nos dice también Gonca en esta parte, María, es que básicamente, como tal, digamos, la estructura del ULIC, creo que se llama, el UL, pues básicamente no responde necesariamente a una modelación como tal de mitigación o de medición del impacto, digamos, que eso tiene en las emisiones de CO2, sino que más bien es un poco un mapeo de expectativas, ¿no? Efectivamente ver como cuánto es el recurso disponible y qué puedo hacer con ese recurso. No sé si tengas algo que responder en esta parte, María, o estás
No,
de acuerdo.
no. Sí,
Okay.
de acuerdo.
For Maria, it's quite clear as well that, and so she shared your thoughts about like the methodology related to the ULCO, and also the expectations of this kind of models that is not only focused or mainly focused in the reduction of the carbon emissions that you are putting outside, is more like an exercise of measuring capabilities of what you can do and what you can produce, and with different niches you can attend with these industries, right?
Jamie, you're muted, I think.
Oh.
There we go. I think
Okay.
I hear you now.
Sorry for that. Technical difficulties. Thank you so much for everybody and their questions. We have approximately 7 minutes left in this time, and we have a few questions in the Q&A box from participants. Please put any more in if you would like, or alternatively, I think, just put them in the box. We're not going to have people come off mute during this time. So I'm going to start with one in terms of specific to the IMO and how it is evaluating and considering ILUC. But the question is, what are the advantages and risks of applying the risk-based approach to ILUC at the global, regional, or project level? So those 3 different levels. Are there other options in terms of applying that risk-based as well? Or is it those 3?
I can start. I think this was like a proposal that was brought into IMO, this global, regional, and project level. As we already explained, ILUC is a global phenomenon. So, I mean, the only way to really mitigate it, or at least, have some sort of impact or to reduce, it should be considered at a global level, because this is like the commodity markets and how they interact with each other, and Colin could speak to that more, I suppose. But now at the IMO, the GSAMP group is more focusing on the project level, which is for us, I guess, like starting from the wrong place. Instead of like going global, first identifying the feedstocks that might be harmful and then taking care of those, because basically it's not, I mean, I think I should say like low ILUC risk, or this project level things that are seeking for low ILUC certification is just like exceptions to high ILUC risk, right? And actually, I mean, we can't say like there's something that's ILUC 0. That does not exist. So, I mean, starting from like looking for exceptions is not the right way to do this. Like, we should really start with the risks and try to prevent them first. And then if there are exceptions, yes, we can look into those. There might be so in reality. I don't deny that. But first things first, we have to prevent the risk factors and then go look for exceptions if they exist.
Yeah, in addition to that, I think it's helpful to think of the risk-based approaches as kind of a simplifying rule or a heuristic, where you take the ILUC analysis and sort of behind the scenes how the do the analytical work, but you set the categories. And the purpose of having the risk-based approach is to make it so every project doesn't need to do a full quantitative ILUC analysis in the way that perhaps like the low carbon fuel standard in California sort of thinks, or other similar programs might do that. So whether those sort of simplifying rules or heuristics are valuable, it depends on one, what was the quality of the analysis that went into establishing them. If you have a really high quality ILUC sort of modeling effort and a good consultative process that goes around it, it's certainly I think it's possible to develop categories like that. But realize that the categories are not going to be sort of written in stone. They're not necessarily going to apply to everything equally, and there's going to be a lot of case by case analysis needed. And the categories and individual fuels might move between categories over time, where at one point, given sort of market conditions, a fuel might be a lower risk, and then as time goes by, global demand for that goes up, it might be in a higher risk category. The challenge is, in a lot of cases, those categories are not going to have complete coverage of all of the novel crops, novel geographies, novel cultivation practices that someone might try to bring to bear as a tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you could say that things like off-season cover crops or double cropping or the use of degraded land, these are things that are likely to reduce the ILUC impact of a biofuel, but there will be situations in which that's not necessarily the case, and you have to be careful about sort of extending general rules too far and viewing them as immutable universal rules.
Bueno, digamos que para Colombia, nosotros el enfoque basado en riesgos para evaluar el cambio climático indirectamente, pues digamos que ha sido una forma de evolucionar, pasando, digamos, de modelos tradicionales a unos que nos permiten, pues, digamos, generar eh, un enfoque con, digamos, un contexto de diversidad de suelos y de productividad que tenemos.
So from the Colombia perspective, that what the things that we have been carrying on is to start to analyze the projects and the de-risking, taking into account basically the climate change, because on that
Yeah.
matter we will be able to define the different areas available in different time spans of the year.
Bueno, Colombia, digamos, ha avanzado en diferentes marcos de gobernanza, digamos, monitoreo de deforestación y de quemas certificadas, que digamos que ofrecen una oportunidad para precisar pues esa realidad del país y bueno, se utiliza, digamos, estos enfoques con estos nuevos modelos globales para lograr tener unos estándares de sostenibilidad en el uso de la tierra.
Other thing that Colombia is implementing currently is different models of governance, which is basically try to territorialize, put in the territory, basically on the local authorities, some sort of responsibilities of mapping, for example, areas that are currently used for one or another activities, or for example, the burning of the crops in order to use that land that we're using to cultivate any kind of crops. They can burn after the harvester. They can burn like the debris of that activity and use that land for other activities or regrowth different species or different harvesting that is useful for the perspective of ILUC.
En ese contexto, más que una solución única con estos enfoques, en el enfoque basado en riesgos se debe tener como una parte de un esquema integral. Entonces, su mayor valor pues, es complementar otros instrumentos como otros modelos globales, los sistemas de certificación, es decir, hacia unos modelos más híbridos que, digamos, combinen rigor técnico con la flexibilidad del contexto del territorio.
So from the Colombia perspective as well, we are trying to keep working on a comprehensive scheme that basically complement different instruments that already exist in the Colombian regulatory frame. We're trying to find a global and hybrid certification models that comply with perfectly with the Colombian culture and activities and different policies that are currently carried on by the central government and also by the territorial government. But obviously, we are not able, or it doesn't make any sense to combine that kind of different structures and opportunities without the technical rigor that is necessary to implement this kind of projects and this kind of projects and obviously the related policies properly.
Digamos que ya finalmente, o como conclusión, pues para países productores como el nuestro, este tipo de, digamos, de elementos pues nos permiten generar un equilibrio para poder, digamos, mantener un desarrollo económico de microeconomías, que pasa mucho porque tenemos un territorio con muchos campesinos, comunidades, que, digamos, tienen sus propias actividades productivas. Se garantiza tema de seguridad alimentaria, equidad y pues también se cuenta con espacios para generar cultivos energéticos para mantener la transición energética con una producción de bios pues controladas, teniendo en cuenta pues las otras actividades que tenemos.
So finally, to conclude, for producing for countries like Colombia that are basically or mainly focused on the production of this kind of raw bio or of these raw materials or biomaterials that are used for these processes, all these projects have to be thinked and analyzed in order to enable the development of sustainability initiatives, which means food security, definitely energy crops, a sustainable strategy to harvest these energy crops and also to control the biomass production.
All right, thank you to all the panelists for those answers. We are already over time, so I want to just quickly get any last minute thoughts and closing statements from the attendees if there's anything else that you would like to mention. And also, we will be continuing to have this conversation in the future. This isn't the end all, but if there's anything else that you'd like to mention for this last bit.
I just want to quickly, because I saw in the questions that people are, mentioning, the regional realities and, how they could be reflected. But we should also think that this is like a global scheme. And yes, regional realities are really important to consider, but with the complexities of certifying, these things at the regional level and how they could be then combined at the international level is really something hard, and I don't deny that. But yeah, so I guess we need to be really like trying to mitigate the risks and then really taking care of the regional realities will find a way forward, I guess. That's what I would say.
I think my final thought, at the risk of being a little self-serving as an academic, is this is an exceptionally complex space to operate in. And there has not been enough kind of research into alternative fuel policy and the economic systems and the support systems as we need to effectively answer these questions over the last years. So we are in some ways flying blind. I think there needs to be a lot more investment in not just kind of the research tools and the papers and the data and the outcomes, but also in the people and developing enough people to work for the regulatory programs, the companies, the advocacy groups, again, building the human capital necessary to effectively implement and administer these programs. And so To the extent that the audience has the capacity to make investments in research, there's a desperate need to support research, get more people coming through graduate programs to work on stuff like this, because there are a lot of questions. And while, as an alternative fuel policy researcher, it's nice to be sort of in demand, there are way more questions than myself and my colleagues could possibly answer. There need to be a lot more people doing what I do in order to help policymakers make good decisions moving forward.
Bueno, digamos que para las instituciones públicas es muy importante pues estas herramientas tecnológicas que permiten pues tomar diferentes decisiones. A la final, la organización del territorio y conocer pues sus propias necesidades y capacidades son las que nos permiten de pronto llegar a la producción o generación de diferentes energéticos que permitan pues la descarbonización del sector.
What Maria is telling us is that definitely it's important to use this kind of tools and this kind of approaches in order to definitely a decision-making informed process. Also, there is also a complementary activity which is critical for development economies such as Colombia, is the complete knowledge of the territory. I mean, for Colombia, it's quite common to be aware of the different, for example, critical minerals and locations or activities related to that kind of things, oil and gas, minerals, etc. But on this kind of new matters and new businesses and new models of decarbonization, there is definitely an opportunity of using this kind of tools in order to obviously comply with the international regulatory frame, but also to comprehend the territory and also achieve the different goals that the government has committed on obviously on the decarbonization and the reduction of greenhouse emissions.
So that brings us to the end of our session. I want to sincerely thank Gonca, Colin, and Maria for such an honest and expert discussion. This dialogue is crucial for the IMO. I also want to express our gratitude to Maria and her colleague for speaking in their second language. Thank you for making this conversation so accessible. We had a lot of great questions in the Q&A. We will follow up as we send the slides as well as the video. So don't worry, we'll do our best to answer the questions that have come before us, or at least bring some thoughts before you as well. The recording of today's session, again, will be shared with everyone who registered. If you know anybody who would be interested in this conversation, please pass on the link so that they too can receive the video. Pacific Environment will continue to engage in the IMO processes in the months ahead. If you would like to connect at the IMO or anytime, please reach out to us. Our contact details will be in the follow-up email. I want to leave you all with something. We do not need miracles to change the world. We only need each other. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The IMO has a choice right now. Build a framework that is scientifically robust, practical, implementable, equitable to the countries and communities most affected. And so Pacific Environment's position is clear. Durability, integrity, and equity are not trade-offs. They are prerequisites. The tide is turning. Let's make sure it carries us to a zero-emission future. Thank you all, and until next time, next slide.
Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.